Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about the Massachusetts End-of-Life Options Act with John Berkowitz, Director of Western Mass Death with Dignity, Dr. Kate Atkinson, family physician from Amherst, and Dr. Shelley Berkowitz, also a family physician. They're all in support of this legislation. We're going to begin with Dr. Atkinson. I'd like to ask you to outline the requirements of what it would be for a patient requesting aid in dying medication.
Well, this all has to come directly from the patient. The patient makes an appointment to meet usually with their primary care physician, hopefully their primary care or their oncologist, and they need to explain orally to that doctor that they would like to end their life early. Then there's a 2-week waiting period. Then they need to meet with another physician. I don't have all the specific details. I'll push you to John Berkowitz for that. But the key thing is to give the patient autonomy and have more of a say in how they want to lead their life. And they have to be the ones asking for it.
All right, let's pull John back in then. John, if a patient meets the requirements, what would be the next steps for being approved for the procedure?
Well, first of all, just to really emphasize, a patient has to be terminally ill with 6 months. The diagnosis is 6 months or less to live. So the first doctor has to say, I'm sorry, you have 6 months or less to live. And the patient has to get that verified by a second doctor, an oncologist or a general practitioner. But second doctor has to look at the charts, look at the record, and attest in writing. Two different doctors, and by the way, that's 2 weeks apart, so nothing impulsive can happen. Nobody can suddenly get a medication after one doctor and run out, you know what I mean? That this is a very deliberative process, and that's part of the safeguards that I was mentioning before.
All right, thank you. Let's pull Dr. Berkowitz back in now. Dr. Berkowitz, what qualifications will doctors need to be considered for making determinations of a patient's diagnosis and prognosis?
Well, first of all, any physician who's licensed in Massachusetts can be part of this process under the conditions of this bill. But I would like to think, first of all, that they would go to their primary care doctor as one who knows them and knows their personal life, and whatever specialist is the most logical who has given them their diagnosis and prognosis, say an oncologist if they have cancer. And the most important characteristic is that those doctors need to be comfortable talking about death and dying in real human terms with that person. In addition, the mental health practitioner, who's another provider who the person is required to see under this law, would be sure that they didn't have an added diagnosis that they shouldn't have to qualify for this law, which is that they're not suffering from depression or another mental health condition, say addiction, untreated, that would preclude them from making an unclouded decision.
And so, Dr. Atkinson, for some of our viewers, this subject matter is really new to them. Could I have you talk about what type of medication would be used and how would it be applied?
So that is a very good question. The types of medications are things that are available through the pharmacist. There are drugs like secobarbital and phenobarbital. This is not something I know a great deal about, and I would be deferring to my pharmacy colleagues and to the literature and what they're using in Oregon. I would explain to the patient that the whole process, again, has to be initiated by them. Usually they start by taking medicine to keep from feeling nauseated before they take, and then they take something that makes them feel a little sleepy before they take the final dose. People, from what I understand, really want to organize it, have their family around them, and feel like it's something that they're in charge of near the end. And I would imagine people do it differently. I always find it interesting how many people choose not to take the medicine, but just knowing that they have it, again, it's about control. I had a patient a few years ago who had a terminal brain cancer, and she came to me and asked if I would do something for her. And I agonized over it because I really wanted to be able to help her. And I also didn't want to lose my license or go to jail. I need to be able to have these conversations with patients. I'm no leading expert on dying, but I am a leading expert on the families I take care of. And I want to be there and be in the room with them as they're making these discussions.
All right, thank you. And Dr. Berkowitz, let's pull you in again. I'd just like you to touch on, one of the concerns of those who are opposed to the right to die legislation is that people other than the patient may be making the decision to end someone's life. So what specifically do you think should be in the bill to help protect patients from someone else making that decision?
Well, what I think should be in the bill is actually what is in the bill, which is the requirement, first of all, that the person is evaluated by a mental health clinician. This is not something that's in the bills that were passed in some, or I'm not sure all of the other states. John would know that, but at least not some of them. And this helps to determine that they're of sound mind. They're making this decision not based on depression or feeling guilty of being a burden in some way to their family, and that they're able to communicate their wishes clearly. Also, that the bill requires two physicians, as we've already said, at least 2 weeks apart. So this is not a rash, impetuous decision, which is often what happens with suicide. It's a thoughtful plan that takes place. It may not be activated for more than 2 weeks. It could be 3 to 4 weeks, the way it is to get an appointment with a doctor or clinician in Massachusetts. So I'm very comfortable that there are safeguards in this bill to protect.
Okay. And when we continue our conversation, we'll have that when we return. You're watching 22 News in Focus.